Good evening. Hispanic Heritage Matters in Texas proudly hosts Dr. Amy Porter, Karla Aguilar, and Erika Haskins. Tonight, we're talking about women in Spanish Colonial Texas. This evening, we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Amy Porter, Professor of History at Texas A&M San Antonio. We also have Karla Aguilar, a Development Director with the American Indians in Texas at the Spanish Colonial Missions, as well as Erika Haskins with the University of the Incarnate Word, where she is a graduate research assistant in Women and Gender Studies. The video picks up Amy Porter giving us her introduction.
So my research has focused on women in the Spanish Southwest. The period I really like is the late Spanish colonial period through maybe the 1830s, 1840s or so. But certainly I'm interested in the entire Spanish colonial period. And now that I've been in San Antonio for so long, my research has really focused much more on women in the San Antonio area. So I'll stop there and pass it along to the other panelist.
Karla or Erika, help yourself. Make sure you unmute if you would. Karla?
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Shumanam. My name is Karla Aguilar, and I'm the Development Director at American Indians in Texas at the Spanish Colonial Missions. Our nonprofit organization was established by the Tepilam Coahuiltecan Nation, which is a tribal community primarily based here in San Antonio. And it was founded about 40 years ago as a matter of reintegration of a tribal community that, because of the missionization experience and things that I'll address in my talk, have had to reintegrate. And so over the history of the Tepilam Coahuiltecan Nation, they've done a lot of work to fill in a lot of the gaps through research and genealogical ties and unearthing themselves through this process. And so myself, my background is in political economy and social development in Latin America. I've always had a fascinating assessment of the world through what makes it tick. And usually, I had a chapter of my life where I was a radio journalist, and I was always taught, follow the money. And so through the practice of political economy, being able to understand the historical context and being able to complement the Spanish colonial experience, or what we call the Spanish colonial period, which was not as, which is very complex and nuanced as well, looking at it from an indigenous lens, a Native American lens, which I hope to bring to the table today and help to bring more questions to the table than anything else. So thank you so much, Antonio, for having us today. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for making yourself available and joining us this evening. Miss Erika Haskins.
Good evening, everybody. And Anthony, thank you as well for inviting me to share some of this research on women and our early Texas history. My name is Erika Haskins, and I am a University of the Incarnate Word doctoral student in the Dreeben School of Education with a concentration in organizational leadership. I am a graduate research assistant there as well in the Women's and Gender Studies program. I also earned my bachelor's in business from UIW and my master's in religious studies from UIW and a master's in organizational leadership from Our Lady of the Lake University. So I am a proud 10th generation Texan. And some of my scholarly work includes original research on the alcalde Domingo Bustillo, the Spanish governor Juan Antonio Bustillo y Ceballos, and other alcaldes, most recently Manuel Ituri y Castillo. I was mentored under the wonderful Dr. Frank de la Teja and Dr. Andres Tijerina, and also Dr. Porter has been very influential in my life and in my research and studies, and so has Dr. Frances Galan, who couldn't be with us tonight. But let me see, my research focus is young women's leadership in the leadership department for my dissertation, but I also study women in Texas history as well as leadership overall in early Texas history. And I am an active member, and I feel I need to announce this, but that I am an active member of the DRT, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, for the Alamo Careers chapter for over 10 years. I am a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution in the San Antonio de Bejar chapter. I'm very active in the San Antonio Conservation Society and the Women's Club of San Antonio and Los Alcaldes de Bejar. So thank you very much for having me this evening. I look forward to the conversations.
Excellent. Thanks again, Erika, for coming this evening and making yourself available. So, you know, besides being Women's History Month, like Erika, in her personal research that she's done for her family's genealogy, that's one of the struggles that I had was looking at and trying to find information about my grandmothers. And I was reading shortly after Dr. Porter's book was published, their lives and their wills, and in her introduction, it was spot on. You know, she talks about how, you know, you can learn all about I mean, you can find many books on Sam Houston. I can't tell you how many stories and books there are about, you know, Jim Bowie and the other Americans that were at the Alamo, and Stephen F. Austin, the quote unquote father of Texas. But, you know, when I stumbled upon my grandmother in my family tree, and her name was Gertrudis Navarro, I had a hard time finding any information about her life. But lo and behold, when you use Google, that tool that many of our genealogists use, lo and behold, there's a picture of her. And so that kind of helped me understand that it's out there. You just have to look. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Porter and ask her to kick us off and talk about what we can learn about women in Spanish colonial Texas if we dig deep enough and wide enough.
Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation this evening. And I'd like to point out, Karla made a really important point. We're talking about Spanish Texas, and we're going to define this really from a Eurocentric perspective, right? So we're talking about, if we say Spanish Texas, the arrival of the Spanish until independence. You know, when I teach Texas history or my Colonial America class, we always start off with, you know, approximate dates, 20,000 to 15,000 years ago. You know, we're looking at some of the earliest Americans, right, or earliest Texans, if we're looking at this place. And those stories are extremely important, and I'm glad Karla's here to talk about those. I'll probably reserve most of those comments for her on the independent Indian communities and focus on the Spanish settlements. One conversation I think we need to have right off the bat or think about, and you all can ask me questions about this, we might all define geographically Spanish Texas differently as well. I always, when I start an article or start a research project, I sit down and I think, okay, do I use how it was defined at the time by, you know, the people running the government? So are we talking about the most important settlements would be San Fernando de Bejar, which I'll refer to as Bejar. And then early on Los Adais, later Nacogdoches, if we're talking about East Texas. Or do we look at Texas today, right? And look at the settlements, the Escandon settlements, right, in the valley. Because if we don't do that, I think there's a good chance that Latin Americanists or historians of Mexico might neglect those areas because they might say it's Texas history. And then we have the El Paso question, right? So when I write about the Spanish colonial period, I talk about El Paso del Norte as part of New Mexico because it was New Mexico at the time. But of course, that story is important in Texas history today. So I would argue that we be flexible with our definitions of Spanish Texas. And when Karla makes her points, she'll show how I'm sure those borders were somewhat irrelevant in many ways from an indigenous perspective. Another important point I want to make right off the bat has to do with the experiences of different groups of women. Time is extremely important here. That, you know, the time in which these women live, the geographical space, age, class, ethnicity, race. If we think about the intersections of all of these different experiences, we'll get closer to understanding what life was like for these women. And that's a lot to remember as we move through this history, but I'll do the best I can here. I always find it helpful to, when I look at the Spanish borderlands, to, for one piece of this, go back to Spain and think about Spanish expansion into Texas as part of a broader story of the expansion of the Spanish Empire. And it's really important for women's history, I think. So the Reconquest in Spain, I'll do this quickly. I don't want y'all to think I'm gonna make y'all sit through hundreds of years of history here. But 711 to 1492 are extremely important years in Spanish history. We have the arrival of the Moors from North Africa, and really from that point until 1492, the reconquest from the Christian Iberian perspective that's occurring during that period of time. As the Christians in Iberia, or what would become Spain and Portugal, push back the Moors, if you will, and take more territory, the various Spanish kingdoms have a hard time holding on to that territory. You know, most of the fighters, they tend to be men, and the men will not hold on to that territory in and of themselves. They need families to go and settle in those places. So they provide incentives. They tell families, if you'll move here, if you'll live in La Frontera, in the frontier space that we're trying to hold, we'll give you land, we'll give you freedom from taxes, we'll give you titles, various incentives. And we see those policies carrying over into the Americas later. But the other thing that we see is that Spain will offer special incentives for women. They will allow women to have land grants. They will protect Spanish women's property rights. So the Reconquest will strengthen women's access to land and to their legal right that was already on the books to own property. So that's one piece that I think is important, thinking back to the Reconquest. The other piece has to do with the Spanish legal tradition. So Spanish law is based upon Roman law, and that law gave women really strong property rights, at least in comparison to British law. It's going to be similar to the Dutch. It's similar, somewhat similar to the French, but very different from the British. So these laws say that women can own property in marriage, after marriage, before marriage. Property they bring into the marriage remains their own. There are community property laws so that marriage is viewed in a sense as this economic contract. And anything that the married couple earns while they're married belongs to them both equally. So we tend to think of community property being important in divorce cases. Divorce isn't much of an issue here. There are not many people getting divorced. It's not the way we think about divorce anyways, because if a couple separates and the church cannot reconcile them, they are allowed to live apart if it's approved, but neither spouse can remarry until their spouse passes away. So we're not talking about community property as it relates to divorce. It has more to do with the way that the Spanish viewed marriage as this contract, this economic partnership. And it has to do with inheritance too, especially in cases where a spouse becomes a widow and then remarries. So that's an important piece of this. Inheritance as well. families, if they're going to move out onto the frontier, they need to know that, if they have daughters, if they don't have sons, that their daughters will be able to inherit that property. So those rights are there in Spanish law, and they're strengthened during the Reconquest. So what we see in Spanish law is that no child can inherit more than 1/3 to 1/5 of an estate. So all the children inherit fairly equally. There's sort of ways around this if we're looking at some parts of the Spanish Empire, even in northern Mexico, where you have the large haciendas that develop, but we don't have that in Texas. We have smaller ranches that develop. And one of the things we're going to see is pretty equal inheritance. So these conditions, these broad conditions, are going to be really important in shaping women's experiences in Spanish Texas. And they'll be important, and again, I'm going to let Karla talk about the indigenous women, but indigenous women who become part of Spanish society through marriage or through other means that I'll talk about later, they'll have access to this protection through the law as well. So those are a few points that I wanted to make early on. The next one is this. Now, just because the laws are on the books, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily being followed. And that was some of the earlier research that I've done looked at that idea, right? So we know these laws exist, but are women allowed access to exercise these rights? And quickly, I can tell you all, yes, they were. So we see women owning property, in some cases, very large property in Béjar, in the surrounding areas along the Medina, in East Texas as well. We see it certainly in the valley along the Rio Grande, in the El Paso area. So we have land ownership. We have women writing wills, which, I always talk about it. The will first, last wills and testaments, first and foremost, are religious in nature, and they're really about a good death and protecting one's soul. But they are about property too. They do mention property, and one of the things we see is property being passed on from women to their children and to daughters in particular. We also see court cases where women are actively protecting their legal rights. And there are a lot of disputes over land and over inheritance. And I'm not going to say the women always win those, but they do get heard in court. And many of those are favorable. Many of the outcomes are favorable to women. So that's an important point, that women know these rights and they're exercising them. It's also important to point out, though, as we take sort of this big view, that socially and culturally, this is a patriarchal society. If we're talking about the Spanish society, the Spanish government, it's run by men. The formal power is in the hands of the men. So women aren't holding formal political offices. The other really important institution of Spanish Texas would be the Catholic Church. And if we look at the Catholic Church in Texas, again, women aren't holding those positions of power within the Catholic Church. But I think it's really important. It's important to make that point. This is what we're talking about with a patriarchal society. But when we're talking about women, we're looking for other ways that women exercise power. And what we see in these institutions is women exercising informal power. Maybe a little less so politically than we see within the church or within people's religious lives. In other Spanish settlements, so not in Texas, there were convents. There were opportunities for women to become nuns and to join convents. That opportunity does not exist in Texas. So I think that's one important point. Most convents anyways, the women living there would be cloistered or sequestered. But We do see some convents in Mexico City, for example, where women are doing a lot of work in their communities. The other point I would make, though, is that if we look beneath sort of the hierarchy of the church, we can find the cofradías, the confraternities, and women were extremely active in those organizations. And they're the ones who are organizing festivals and feast for saints. And those are really important religious and social events for the community. We also see women as playing really important roles as sort of the spiritual heads of the family, if you will. And I would argue one way that we see this is through the religious items that women own, the altars in their homes, that if you read the wills, you see this quite clearly. Men have some of these things, but women have much more, and they tend to pass them on to the daughters. And it's clear that that role, the religious observance within the home, rest with the women. So what I'm getting at here, I'm making some sort of broad points, but we have to remember with women's history, it's always important to sort of look beneath the surface. You know, it's important that women aren't the governors of Texas, right? That they're not the alcaldes, that they don't have those roles. But we can't stop there. We have to say, well, then what roles do they have? What are they doing? How are they exercising influence? I also want to say just a few things about demographics because they're really important in this story as well. The settlements in Spanish Texas, the Spanish settlements, remained quite small throughout this entire period. We're going to see, according to census data, the population of Spanish Texas seems to peak in the 1700s, maybe around 3,000 or so. So we're talking about very small communities. And the population remains largely stagnant throughout the 18th century, and there's times it even declines. So that's important in these experiences. You know, I think in some ways that can be seen as limiting. You know, these aren't big economies, for example, but those limits open the doors for women to play important roles in those economies. Because when we see the larger, more complicated economies of, even if we just look a little further south in Saltillo, for example, the women seem to be shut out just a little bit more than what we see in Béjar, for example. The sex ratio was fairly even in Spanish Texas, although generally, if we look, and there's not fantastic census data, most of it's coming from the late 1800s, but if we use some wills and some other documents, it seems pretty clear that this remains the case. More men than women, especially in the settlements where there are presidios. So what we're seeing is that one of the big draws, or one of the major forms of employment in these Spanish Texas communities, would be the military. And some of those men are married, but some of them are single. So I think that tells us normally we would expect to see a fairly even sex ratio, but probably more women than men. This is a little bit unusual, but that's an important point to make when we're talking about women's experiences. Mortality rates were very high throughout the Spanish colonial period. If we're talking about within the Spanish settlements, of course, if we're talking about the indigenous people, we're talking about, you know, really some devastating mortality rates. Within the Spanish settlements, average life expectancy tended to hover around the early 40s or so. And this might seem shocking. If some of you all have done family history, you'll find somebody who lived into their 80s, who lived a quite long life, but infant mortality rates were very high, and that brings down that life expectancy. If we look at the ethnicity of people that's listed in the censuses or other government documents, I mean, this is highly problematic. We might have a conversation about this, but we're going to see people listed as Indio, Espanol, or mestizo. Those would be the most common categories. And then there would be some other categories listed. Fewer were listed as Black, though there were some slaves, some African slaves, especially in East Texas and then some in Spanish Texas. Just a disclaimer here, the ethnic data is highly problematic because one of the things we see is that you can trace a person. There's several examples of this in different government documents where their ethnicity is listed in a different way. So, it's unclear how this is being decided. Is it somebody says, oh, you look like a mestizo, so I will mark you down as a mestizo? Or is the person saying, this is my ethnicity and that's being recorded? One of the things that historians tend to argue about these frontier areas of the Spanish borderlands is that these ethnic categories are very fluid. You have people moving in and their background's not necessarily known, and they can reinvent themselves to a certain extent. But all of these demographics have a huge impact on women's experiences. What this means, those mortality rates are very important. It means that women, almost all the women in these communities, in fact, I'm not sure I've ever found one who did not marry at least once. So that's going to be a common life experience. The women are likely to be widowed. The data indicates both men and women experience widowhood at high rates, but women tend to be younger at age of marriage than their husbands. So the women, if they survive childbirth, tend to outlive their husbands. Many women remarry, so they might be widowed more than once. I should say, if they're widowed when they're young, they tend to remarry. The women were also likely to have experienced the loss of a child. And, I think it's always really important for us to remember, I'm talking about numbers and overall experiences, but also that individual experience and just how devastating and traumatic these experiences can be for these individuals. And then I think these demographics also offer some economic opportunities. The survivors, if you will, they're going to inherit property, whether that's land or movable property. There's not a lot of capital, a lot of money in many of these settlements, especially if you go further north, Behar, for example. There's not a lot of money in circulation. There's more of an informal economy, a barter economy at times, if you will, and that opens opportunities for women in the economic realm as well. A few general things when we're talking about economics. Ranching is going to be a really important part of this story. Cattle. Cattle were brought to Texas by the Spanish. They were lost or intentionally let go to breed on their own. And when the Spanish came back and started to formalize their settlements, they found these large herds of cattle, and that became one of the few economic opportunities on the frontier. But as we move through the 1700s, those wild cattle herds are really in decline, and the economic situation becomes more dire. If we're talking about East Texas, really the East Texas settlements are going to survive based on what's throughout most of the period illegal trade with the French. And that's a story I wish Dr. Galan was here. He could tell much better than I can, but I can make that point at the very least. So I think that's gives you all a broad overview, some patterns to think about as we go through and maybe talk about some more specific experiences. But I wanted to allow some time for Karla and Erika to add their thoughts at this point.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Porter. So Karla, Erika, any thoughts about what Dr. Porter has just shared before we transition to Karla's discussion on Indigenous women?
If I may, I think thank you so much, Dr. Porter, for your research and efforts to lay some primer down. As you know, it's a very nuanced and complex, and there's layers and layers to be able to paint and a clearer picture. And I really want to underscore one component here about why it is that it's so hard to have access to documents or from an academic foundation to be able to document these things, is this question of the scholarship. Who's supposed to write those stories? Particularly, like, for example, looking at it from a Native American lens, Native American studies scholarship doesn't really consider Texas, because it's kind of like, wait a minute, that was Mexico. And then for scholars in Mexico, they'll look at the tribal communities that were in the northern areas of their traditional territory and previous national borders, and they'll say, oh, well, you know, that's Texas history. They can write that story on the other side. But the scholarship, particularly in this time period that we're talking about, because it's in that multiple in-betweens, there isn't as much documentation out there to be able to tell this story. And I really applaud the efforts of those that are willing to go in and move things out of the way and dig a little bit deeper to be able to tell this story, because it is the foundation and bedrock, for example, at least of our cultural norms in San Antonio, like deep San Antonio borderlands culture as well. And for those that are doing that scholarship in that in between, there's a treasure troves that are out there to be able to begin to lay that picture. So thank you for acknowledging that, and then just to encourage anyone else who's interested in doing that research to giddy up with that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Karla. Erika, did you want to share a comment or a thought?
Just thank you, Dr. Porter, and thank you, Karla. That was wonderful insights. I really think it's fascinating how, just as Dr. Porter described, even 242 years later, and I'll be talking about Maria Urbana's life 242 years later, you know, how everything Dr. Porter covered, when I tell Maria's story, most of it is gathered from her will. And that's how, you know, intricate the details were in the will, and we'll be taking a look at that her, you know, how that scholarship, her dissertation, and her book play an important role in how we piece these stories together.
Excellent, thank you, and I'll piggyback on that later, and share my thoughts later on. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask Karla to join us in a conversation about what was Indigenous women's life like, because as Dr. Porter said, you know, when we start the story of Texas, it doesn't start with, you know, Cabeza de Vaca and Ponce de Leon. You know, it's the thousands and thousands of years of our Indigenous cousins that have been here for those many years. So what during that Spanish colonial period, because we, you know, we'll want to box it in. I don't want you to have to go back to the year 20,000 BC. So, but can you share with us what was it like for the Indigenous women?
Sure, absolutely, and thank you so much. So before I dive in, let me first set my timer, because I know once I get on a roll, it's beyond me. Before going in any deeper, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the ancestors of the lands that we reside on here in what is now known as San Antonio, that we know in the Pajalate language as Yanaguana, which is translated as land of the spirit waters. Pajalate was one of the languages spoken in this area, and we're fortunate enough to have some documents that were translated by the Spanish for the purposes of evangelization, and the confessionals that had sufficient vocabulary that scholars have been dedicating years to being able to piece the language back together. And so acknowledging those ancestors that came before us here in this beautiful land that we call home. And if you'll imagine, and in your mind, you have a map of what is now called Texas. And if you bring up that map in your mind, we're looking at, such as Dr. Porter was saying, let's talk about what we're talking about in terms of spatial geographic area. So I want you to pop up that map in your mind and imagine all of the rivers and tributaries that feed into the Gulf Coast and all of the springs that exist in the Central Valley. Here in San Antonio, we have the Blue Hole. There's the Comal Springs, the springs in San Marcos, Austin, Waco, and there's a line of springs that feeds that Central Valley. And if you keep going further south, and of course the geography has changed with ranching and so forth, but before it was as arid as that area now between where we find ourselves down into the Rio Bravo, now called the Rio Bravo. It was the landscape was very different. Definitely a lot of game, a lot of rabbits, turtles, deer, an abundance of fish, and is the context for a ripe society where we have friars that would write back to the crown. And I can give this reference at some point later, right back to the crown, encouraging more colonists to come here because there was a feast at every turn. And when we talk about there being people living here for, 10, 15, 20,000 years, the archaeological record keeps expanding. Just here on the south side, we have an archaeological site that Texas A&M had been working on that found one fire pit that had been dug down, and they dated 8,000 years in one cooking pit. If you can imagine how special it would be to be able to cook on your great-great-great-grandmother's, pans and pots, and have her comal and those items that inherit the molcajete, how much that means to us nowadays, to think about being able to cook at the same fireplace that your people have been cooking at since time immemorial. And that grounds, I hope, the imagination in the possibilities of where we are and what had come to us, right? So fast forward to maybe 350 years ago, you had swaths of people that had been inhabiting in this area, trading north and south, and using these riverways and having their own complex clan structures. The areas around where we are now were not agricultural societies up until the Spanish brought in the corn and beans and different things that they had picked up in their southern colonial ventures. The people that lived where we're talking about in this instance of South Texas, borderlands, if you can imagine that line of people, and from what is now Coahuila, because this area was called Coahuila y Texas, this swath of people that lived between what is now Coahuila all the way up, maybe up until like that Waco area and just under the piney woods, and then kind of bringing down along the coast. So people would have their multiple clan societies that lived in these different areas, hunting, gathering, trading, and I'm sure warring at sometimes as well, right? But kind of inhabiting themselves in these little clusters. And so when the waves of disease started making their way along the so-called colonial frontier, you had a massive loss of life where by the time that folks were beginning to come and write about these places, the population had already begun to be devastated. And so the population was not as dense as it was, as we're told, right? Because a lot of our stories are inherited in oral tradition, or sometimes even on cave paintings, and now people are trying to discern the stories that are there from very poor Western eyes, right? And so the documentation that we have access to is really small. So I want to talk a little bit more about those lost histories and why it is so difficult to be able to have an understanding of what life was like during this period. Yes, the influence of the Catholic Church was extremely, I was going to say oppressive, but I'll just go ahead and say it, and I hope not to offend anyone. But the kind of mentality that was imported into what is now called Texas at the time was right out of inquisitorial Spain. And so anything that was outside of what the friars and the priests were promoting or bringing was very much rejected. And so folks had to fall in line, and it was a matter of survivance of the people and the culture. As Dr. Porter related, there weren't a whole lot of women that came over from Spain. The soldiers and the administrative infrastructure that came over from the crown and building out the infrastructure of the colonies was predominantly men, and these men married Native women. And we know here, for example, in American history, we oftentimes it's frustrating because we jump from, the American Revolution to the Civil War, but we don't talk about how it is that extermination practices happened in North America systemically throughout the 1700s and 1800s. And in South Texas, it was very different. We didn't have the same kinds of massacres, bloody, terrible massacres that occurred all along like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. The Trail of Tears expansion was very bloody and violent for most of like North America in that sense. Maybe the French were a little bit less brutish in that sense, but we have an experience that happened much earlier in the colonial experience where what we call it genocide by ink, because as soon as that man married this payaya woman or pajalate woman or borrado woman at whatever mission that they were at, she became a mestiza. Or in documents, I've also seen it written as the criada, or India, and different levels of the caste system as it was managed during the Spanish colonial period. So you could have been born someone who was harame, and then you married a Spanish soldier, and you became a mestiza, and then maybe you were widowed, and then you remarried, and then you became a Spanish citizen in one lifetime. Just being able to, well, they became Spanish citizens, but you could continue to increase your caste value based off of your marriages or acquisitions of land and so forth, which I think is really important for those of you that are doing your research. And it's, we can discuss what the multiple reasons are for why folks choose to identify with their Spanish heritage, versus their native heritage. But the genetic pool is the same. The source families are the same. And so we have an opportunity to create questions for ourselves in our lineage and inheritance. My best friend holds tight to the idea that her family were part of the Spanish land grants, early on in Padre Island, and says, no, nosotros no somos indios. We don't have anything to do with that. And there's been a systemic erasure that has occurred, not only in the documents, but in our society and our view of Indigenous women, because of this latent racism, classism that has been inherited from the caste system. And I hold in some ways that caste system still has evolved in present day San Antonio. Maybe that'll be a research project in another time when we look at economic stratification in San Antonio. I know that I've hit my 10 minutes, but I did want to just mention how Indigenous women continue to be present and restore themselves in this time, and how that quick, 300 years, y'all, is just a blip in time. It is a hiccup when it comes to social history, cultural history, and we've inherited so much from this genetic pool of our indigenous grandmothers, which I encourage you to continue to do your research on first. Food. There are cooking modalities, ingredients, an essence to the way that we connect with our food that goes beyond just following a recipe. There is a connection that is imbued into the food that is inherent in us because we're connected to the land. And that is something that doesn't, that all cultures have a value for the source of their prized ingredients, whether it's olives or it's corn or deer or buffalo, right? And so in our families, we continue to have that cultural experience aligned with food that ties us to our history. Second, family structures. We've kind of talked a little bit about the power behind the door, right? Maybe in colonial society, and I would say that has also been inherited, that you would maybe have the male voice speaking on behalf of the family, and the decisions are being made at home by the matriarch, which is very much an inheritance that we bring from our indigenous communities, that were very much organized within a matriarchal structure where the women decided what needed to be done and timed out and planned with the seasons, because obviously as women we're on our natural clock, we're naturally in tune with the moon, and the more that we pay attention to our own cycles, we're able to tap into what happens in nature. We're the natural calendar keepers of our communities, and so we would know the whens and the hows for how to do things, right? So then that family internal structure definitely hasn't been interrupted in a lot of ways, but then the negative, the other side of the tortilla in that is that women's voices aren't necessarily the ones that are seen in a public light. And the third one that I think is beautiful, that was mentioned earlier, that is an inheritance that is really beautiful, and I'd love to continue to understand a little bit more in that research of how it is that the women were the carriers of ceremony and guiding things. I think it has to do a little bit with what I was mentioning before, that we knew because of our natural cycles and paying attention to nature and being in tune with the cycles of things, that the women would know when it was time to move to certain places and make certain things happen for the cycles of life to be able to continue. And that inheritance has been translated, I propose, into this religious cultural structure that we see in the Spanish colonial period, as has been documented. But I propose, like, even into our present day, that value of the women caring for that spiritual heart of a household and a family, to be able to ensure that those traditions live on, and as bearers of the culture are the root of that. And so I really am enchanted by that idea in present day of being able to keep those traditions alive. Myself, as a detribalized woman that was raised Catholic, that was raised first Hispanic, then Latina, then the spectrum continued to bring me until I was able to name my people and name who I have that root in, and that those roots are the ones that give me the license, the experience, the agency, and the wherewithal to be able to little by little reclaim what was taken, what was deprived of us. In education, I wish we had the opportunity to teach these things and teach these values, because ultimately everyone benefits from being able to tell a broader narrative of the story, not denying anyone their angle, their perspective and experience in history. But we all benefit when we're able to learn from the entire spectrum rather than just the one myopic colonial view, because that's only the resources that we've been able to look at. And so inviting additional scholarship and questioning so that we can continue to fill in the puzzle of our history this way. Thank you.
Excellent. I think we need to set aside about a day, Karla, where we can talk to you more. I love your passion and your descriptions as you were describing the land and the 8,000-year-old cooking pit. I could imagine exactly what you were describing, and phenomenal. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Porter, Ms. Haskins, any thoughts, comments about Karla's presentation?
I would just say that you made a lot of really important points, and one that stands out to me in particular is, thinking about Indigenous women as go-betweens. I mean, what you're talking about was survival, intermarriage, right? So the Indigenous women would marry the Spanish men, and this was a strategy. I don't know if strategy is the right word, but a cultural practice that had been around for a very long time. So Indigenous women would marry men from other groups, right? Other cultural groups. And that was a way to bind through kinship those groups together. And that's what they were doing with the Spanish as well. And it was largely about survival. And I think that's really important because we had for a period of time scholars, anthropologists, and historians who were saying that the Coaltecans, right, the broader term that they'd used for these Indigenous people, had disappeared, that they didn't survive. And it was because they weren't looking at the history through the lens of the Indigenous people or through the lens of the women, and understanding, no, they did survive, they're still here. And not listening to those oral histories too, right? And those stories are still here. So really important point to make.
Thank you. Erika?
I think thank you for that, Karla. That was wonderful. Very informative, and I really appreciate your scholarship on this. You are very passionate about your research, and I did a couple of things stood out to me. First of all, I don't know who's all in the audience, but I'm sure some people may be familiar with the Pachecos, who have their lineage through the Granados, who is tied to Maria Bentoncourt, who we'll be talking about today. And, when Ralph Pacheco first discovered some Indigenous lineage in the Pachecos, and he expressed that to me, and he sent me the documents and the evidence, I shared that with my family. And just as you said, Karla, my maternal side were, no way, there is just no way, and I was astonished to see that reaction, sort of, I mean, I honestly didn't expect it. I thought they would be more open-minded about it. But no, that it really does, it's embedded in them that they were Spanish royalty. We are from Spain, our ancestors are from Spain, and they had this higher status to this day, So I thought that was interesting. And then also, speaking of Maria, when we get into her, that she did live in that time period where there was a division. There was your side and our side, and they were a higher class, the Canary Islanders. There was this social class system that they did not intermarry. And for those of you who've not read Dr. Tijerina's book on what is his anyway, Dr. Tijerina's book, I'll get that for you in a minute, but he talks about that with the Tejanas and the Canary Islanders, and how that went all the way up until practically the 1830s. He talks about how the Spaniards, divided themselves. They could not intermarry with the Indians or the soldiers, the soldados in San Antonio, and they were looked down upon if they did, or they were ousted, from the community, right? So I thought that was interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ms. Haskins. So while that is true that those stories are out there, when you actually look in the record, we do see many of those intermarriages, and that's what Karla was talking about earlier, right? So you got to dig, right? And so that's one of the things that I'll come to at the end when we talk about challenges and researching and discovering the history of women in Texas, is where to go look for those things, right? So now what I'd like to do is, if I can, I'd like for our three guests to kind of share a short tidbit about a particular woman in Spanish colonial history, if you have one in mind, and a short thumbnail sketch of what it is about this particular woman that maybe has stood out to you. What, as we heard from Dr. Porter and Ms. Aguilar about some of those challenges, how did this particular person address those challenges? And I'll start off with Dr. Porter, please.
Sure, I'm going to start from the sort of tail end of the Spanish colonial period. I've done a lot of research on Maria Calvillo, and she's an interesting figure. She lived 1765 to 1856. She inherited the Rancho de las Cabras, which was a mission ranch of Mission Espada, in 1814. Her father owned this ranch, and he had probably gotten into ranching because of his wife's connections. So he was married to Maria Antonia de Arrocha. But in 1814, there was an attack on the ranch, likely by Lipan Apaches, though there are some stories that a grandson might have been involved in the attack. And Ignacio Calvillo was killed in that attack, and Maria Calvillo inherited that ranch. She referred to herself as a widow at the time. So she wasn't technically a widow. Her husband had left Behar in 1811 or so, when he was sort of on the wrong side of independence at that point. But she referred to herself as a widow, so I will from this point forward as well. She ran this ranch until the 1840s. It was a massive operation. They had a lot of cattle, but sheep and goats also, as the name implies. She increased her land holdings during her life, and she ended up selling most of the Rancho de las Cabras in the 1840s. And she had children, but they did not survive. So another one of these common stories here, but she left the ranch to two adopted children, which is another common pattern. We see a lot of adopted children in Spanish Texas because of these high mortality rates. And there were fights over her estate, but her adopted children did end up with this land. So one of the reasons she's so important, so intriguing to scholars, there's documents about her. Because of the attack on the ranch, witnesses were interviewed, and we learn a lot about how the ranch operated, and that was in 1814. She shows up in the historical record in other ways as a landowner petitioning for land. She has a power of attorney at one point for another man, which is the first time I've ever seen a man giving power of attorney to a woman during the Spanish period. So that's quite remarkable. And then archaeological excavations were done on the ranch. So we know a lot about the material culture, the things that were there at the ranch. And then for me in particular, this time in which she lived is very interesting to see her holding on to this big piece of land throughout all of the change. You know, the late Spanish colonial period, the wars for independence, the Mexican period, the Texas Republic, and then Texas becoming part of the US. So for all of those reasons, you know, I think she shows us the challenges of being a woman at the time, but also those opportunities that I mentioned, you know, being able to be a large landowner. And I will let the others speak.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Porter. Erika or Karla, if either of you have a particular person that you would like, a woman that you would like to share?
Am I other than Maria Bentoncourt, because I'll talk about her? Or would you like for me to share Maria Bentoncourt?
You share whomever you want to share with us. That's fine. So if you want to go ahead, Ms. Haskins.
So Maria Rovada Bentoncourt was my 10th generational grandmother, a great grandmother, but that is not why I am speaking on her. I'm speaking on her because she was a remarkable woman. She was the head of the 14th family of the 16 families that traveled from the Canary Islands to Texas in 1730-31. She journeyed to Texas while she was with child. So that in itself says a lot about the decision that she had to make at, I think she was 27 years old, to come with her husband and pregnant, and then with several other small children as well. So when they landed in Veracruz, surviving the seas and everything they went through, she did lose her husband when they finally landed in Veracruz. He contracted a fever and he died. And then on their next stop in Culutican, she gave birth to her son. So I can imagine, as a woman, what she's already going through just on this journey that has just begun, right? So right before she makes it up to San Antonio, or to the border of Texas, she also loses another child. She arrives in San Antonio, and her will and the records show, and we do have some writings in Chabot's book, that she was of wealth, or a higher class. So she did bring with her some heirlooms, some jewelry, some furniture items. I often wonder, that journey on foot or on wagons, carrying all this on the way up here, had to have been adventurous, but she did make it here, and we know that she did have these items with her, because they are stated in her will that she brought them with her. And she's described as, all of the Canary Islanders are described in detail about what they look like. She was described as a woman of good figure, slender, and had a long face, fair complexion, black hair, eyebrows, and a thin nose. And interestingly, we also have, of course, a description of her children, who some have gray eyes, some have blue eyes, and then some have red hair. And so, that it's very interesting to get a visual of what this family may have looked like. When she arrived in San Antonio, she was one of the more prominent members of the groups, and she's described, I'm not just saying that, she's described as such in the archives as being one of the prominent members of the society, and people really looked up to her. She was very graceful, and she obviously had some leadership capabilities that people were attracted to. She did choose not to marry for a couple of years, although she was eligible, and there were other bachelors eligible, and she could have easily taken advantage of that, Spaniard intermarriage with other prominent males in the communities. But and I'll talk about this in a minute, but there is a story that is in a book published by the Yongana Society in 1980 that talks about a story, and I mentioned this to Anthony, about Juan Leal, the first mayor of San Antonio, seeking her hand in marriage, and then she turned him down. But he is also described in the story as he wanted more to be the power couple. So while he was the head, he was the first mayor of San Antonio, he's perceived to be this marriage to be more of a power couple, not for romance, which she did eventually marry Martin de Armas and had 5 more children from him. So we have many cousins from the first marriage with the Granado and Pacheco line, and then we also have our cousins from the de Armas line. During her time, since she came to Texas, she acquired 3 ranches: Rancho de San Lorenzo de las Mulas, Rancho de San Antonio de Cibolo and Rancho de Palo Quemado. And she, this is important because this is exactly what Dr. Porter was talking about, you know, the acquisition of the land and the power that came with that as an entrepreneur and as ways to provide for herself and for her future generations to come. And then I think it's important to mention that these ranches also provided cattle to the war efforts during the American Revolutionary times, and this is highly discussed among a lot of the families, the Hispanic families of the time period. But specifically in Maria's case, she, at the time, she helped with the cause, but also so did her son, who became prominent in the Spanish Royal Army. He also contributed to the cause. And let me see, this was all under General Galvez's command in Louisiana. And then I think it's important to note, though, that while I bring up Pedro, I need to mention her other two great-granddaughters that I've become familiar with. And one of them some of you may be familiar with, Maria Josefa Granados, who owned one of the largest general stores in San Antonio at the time in the late 1700s. She passed away quite young, but she was a very powerful businesswoman in San Antonio. For that time period, it's almost unheard of. But if you look at her will, you will also notice that she was, you know, just such a wealthy woman. Not only do the archives talk about her home filled with elegance, and but also her general store, and there were many people and many prominent names that you would recognize in the will that owed her money. They owed her money. So I thought that was interesting. And then also later on in the time period, in the early first decades of the 1900s, Esther Carvajal. So for those of you that are not familiar with Carvajal Elementary in San Antonio on the west side, that is named after Esther Carvajal, and she is a great-granddaughter of Maria Rovana and Paula Granados and that line. And she was very proud of her heritage, of her Canary Islander heritage, and she created the very first Spanish curriculum in our public school systems in Texas. So she played a very prominent role in San Antonio, and I think it's important that we celebrate her as well. And then there were just a few stories that are questionable that we see in our archives, or that some things that are out there. And I just like to share, Anthony, her picture with your viewers. This is Maria here. I cannot change the screen. Okay, there she is. This was so the Canary Islander Association does have a copy of this picture. When I've asked in the past to some of the leaders in the association, or they were not sure where this picture has been acquired. I took this picture from a YouTube video that somebody in Spain or somewhere else, I'm sure some of you have seen it, posted in the video of her when talking about the lineage. And then also they state that this is Juan Granados. So whether this is true or not, we are not sure, but it is claimed to be her and Juan Granados. Now, when I did work on a travel exhibition with Dr. Porter over 4 years ago, we created an exhibition where we went around the state of Texas and spoke anywhere we would be heard on. It was called Las Damas de Texas, and we highlighted 4 women in early Texas history, and she was one of them. So prior to this being published, I did have Dr. De La Teja and some other scholars view this photograph before I went out there. This is why I say allegedly this is her, because we are not sure. Dr. De La Teja did state that the time period of her clothing would not have matched up with, you know, her age and everything. So it's questionable, but I thought I would share that anyway, because it's out there and we've seen it. Excellent, thanks. And then here are her 3 ranches, as you can see here. This is Robert Thonoff's scholarship on the ranches during the time of the American Revolution, and I just wanted to kind of highlight where she would have been, her ranches would have been located. I circled them in red here. So fantastic, thank you. That is my story on one of the most remarkable women that I know, you know, in early Spanish Texas history. And thank you for allowing me to share that with you. Absolutely. Karla, is there somebody in particular you'd like to share with us this evening?
Not somebody in particular, but a set of women that I know will incite the imagination of those that are here on the call. So part of what we're dealing with as the Tapilam Coahuiltecan Nation is at the Alamo, which was previously known as Mission San Antonio de Valero. And so we have all of these burial records of families and individuals that were buried there on the site. And so I wanted to share some of the names of the folks that are buried, of these women that are buried there, and their tribal names, so that we can hear their names and give them a little bit of life. And for those of you that I saw some questions about how do we find out more and what kind of resources are out there. My roots are really deep. Yes. So our nonprofit organization has American Indians in Texas has an archive that we have been compiling these documents for 40 plus years that speak to this very specific time period and cultural demographic of the Native American, the foundation, the Aboriginal people of the region. And so those would have been the ones that are documented in the burial books of the Catholic Church for Mission San Antonio de Valero. Of course, right now there's all of this controversy because our tribal community, which is direct inheritors of those folks that are interred at the mission, are not being allowed currently to determine what happens with those remains once they're disturbed from the site. And if folks are more interested in finding out more about that, they can go to our tribal website at tapilam.org, which is TAPPILAM.org. So to say the names of these original mothers, founding mothers, Maria de Jesus from the Patago Nation, Maria de Guadalupe from the Muroame Nation, Juana de Santiago, Hey Yerbi Piame, because sometimes, of course, the translation doesn't come as across as well, Ana Maria of the Solojame Nation, and Maria Antonia Gertrudis of the Payayan Pascac Nation. That's just a handful of those names. I want to uplift the scholarly research of Art Martinez de Vara, who is, this is an excerpt from his forthcoming book on the cemeteries at Mission San Antonio de Valero, and Rudy de la Cruz from Junior, who's also a historian researcher working on early Texas history projects and amazing photographic exhibit that we should partner as well on, because those are the earliest photographs that we have of Texas women as well. So
thank you so much, Karla. Absolutely. And those records can be found online as well. And as Karla had mentioned, there are literally thousands of souls that are buried there at Mission San Antonio de Valero, but you wouldn't know it because the streets are there and the sidewalks are there and the buildings are there, and people have a tendency to think that because there's not a headstone, then it can't be a cemetery, and this is absolutely ridiculous. But anyways, enough of that, because that's not the topic this evening. I do want to share real quickly, and then we'll get to the questions, the story of a few ladies that I'm researching, and I should be done with citing all my sources here within the next week, and then I'll publish the story. And the story is about the Gonzalez sisters. And so in 1818, at the end of the Spanish colonial period, we find Gertrudis de los Santos Coy signing a manumission document, and she releases from the bounds of slavery 3 girls, Maria Antonia, Ana Maria Gonzalez, Maria Antonia Gonzalez, and as well as Ana Josefa Salazar. And for those of y'all that do your genealogy, I will hate to burst your bubble, but it is not the same Ana Salazar that was married to Gregorio Esparza, although that is exactly what you would find out on Ancestry.com. But real quickly, as I read through the manumission document, it's kind of like some of the other challenges with researching women in history. You just can't look at that one document. You've got to dig deeper and you've got to dig wider. And so by digging deeper and digging wider, what I find is that the Gonzalez sisters were the second generations of slaves that were here in San Antonio. Their mother, Candelaria Fierro, was sold at least 5 times in the record among the Presidio soldiers, from Presidio San Juan Bautista, Presidio La Bahia, and then she makes her way to San Antonio with a couple of the soldiers from Presidio San Antonio de Bajar. So she's married to a gentleman who's also a slave. He happens to be the slave of Leonor Delgado. And through that marriage, they have at least 6 children, many of whom, as Dr. Porter had talked about, die at a young age. But the 2 girls and another sister who I'm having a hard time finding, they survive and they live into adulthood. And I want to share with you the power of family and how, you know, we can't let the circumstance define who we are. Although sometimes when you look at that record, we talked about race earlier, right? The question I was posing to myself as I'm reading through these records and I'm doing this research is, was it the race that defined the circumstance, or was it their circumstance that defined the race? And as Dr. Porter had talked about earlier, you know, the casta system and the races that were documented is very fluid. And this is the very first time I've seen somebody's race go from white to being mulata. So was it her circumstance that defined her race? Regardless, one of the things that I think is absolutely powerful, Karla, you talked about the thousands that are buried at the Alamo. But one of the things that really caused me to smile, and I jumped and I did a hoorah, is the fact that their descendants from these 3 slaves were responsible for building the beautiful, although contentious, cenotaph that stands at the Alamo today. So from slaves, from women who were sold among the Presidio soldiers, their descendants become the contractors that were responsible for building, helping the sculptor build the cenotaph that stands today. To me, that's a monument to them. Although their names aren't on it yet, but I'm going to go talk to the founder, the foundry, and see what we can do about somewhere emblazing their names on the cenotaph as well. So we don't have, I do want to get to some of the questions. So we'll talk about maybe some of the challenges in researching women. As I said earlier, one of the ways, the strategies of doing it is to dig deep and dig wide, and then look at those things that you wouldn't otherwise look at. For example, Dr. Porter's book about their wills. Duh, you know, it didn't even, because I'm a business major by trade and education, in human resources, and history wasn't my thing until I started digging into family history. I didn't even think about women having wills, but even wills existed. You know, I thought that was kind of a modern day thing, but wills have been around for hundreds of, probably, Dr. Porter would correct me, probably even thousands of years. I don't know, but that's a place to look. So let's turn our attention, if we can, quickly to get through some of the comments and some of the questions. Dr. Porter, when you were talking, you talked about Spain introducing laws that allowed women land grants and other privileges. About what time frame may that have occurred?
So the laws were codified or I should say they were compiled in the form that's closest to the period we're talking about in the 13th century in the
Wow.
this under Alfonso X of Castile. And then we see some small changes to them, as I mentioned, further influence of the Reconquest after that. But really, that key period is 13th century Spain.
Wow. Phenomenal. So our cousin Josh Bolding has a comment and then a question. He talks about his experience being a Chicano living both here in Texas as well as in Mexico. And it has to do with the influence of women on the family. And the question that he asks is, are there roots in the borderland? Because he talks about how in his comments about how in deeper Mexico is more of a patriarchal, as opposed to what he has experienced along the borderland. So is it your thought or opinion, Dr. Porter, that maybe the borderland area and especially this part of Texas maybe is different with regards to women's influence on the family and making decisions?
That is a fantastic question, and I'm not sure I can answer it thoroughly, but what I would theorize is that, yes, possibly there is a difference. What you tend to see in frontier areas is when imperial power comes in, they're not able to recreate society in the same way that they were in places where they have a larger population or more imperial control. So, throughout world history, we can see other examples of this. So that's what I would theorize. But I don't know if anybody's written about that. I think that's really fascinating. Some others might have some ideas about it.
I think Karla had talked about earlier about how, if we had more time, and I think maybe she and I will sit down and talk about how we might be able to pull together a presentation that talks about the indigenous woman's role, right, and how they were kind of central to the cycle of life and how things were moving. And I think maybe that might be, we may get some of that maybe from our indigenous mothers that were here. Jorge Soriano had a similar question about the emergence of women as keepers of the house, altar, and religious spirit. How did that come about? I don't know if anybody has any theories or some anything that you want to share about how that may have come about.
Yeah, if I may, I think that part of what it's hard. Like, how do you document family traditions? And when in our family inheritance, it's typically the women that set the tone for the culture of a family, and that is something that's very evident. But how do you prove that, right? Like in the Western Occidental sort of like lens. I mean, this is something that we inherently know because we as women, we groom society and guide it that way. So in the period of time that we're talking about, yet again, is just a very, very short blip of time where immigrants from Europe came from the South, and then you had more immigrants come in from the Northeast, and you had people that had been here for a really long time, intermarrying, making all sorts of wonderful mixtures and beautiful babies. And who's raising them is the moms that are set deep into their customs and traditions. And that's not something that you can, dictate away in records. It is something that is inherent into the culture that we have, and very deeply rooted in our families in that sense.
Yeah, I would agree. There's a shout out to you, Karla. I know you were in there earlier. Carolina Hinojosa Cisneros does a shout out to you, and she has a word there. I'm going to mess up. So how would you pronounce that?
That word is Tlazocamati, and it is in Nahuatl and is a colloquial form to wish blessings upon somebody, and we use it as a way of showing appreciation and acknowledgement and gratitude.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. There was an earlier question that asked, where can I find documents regarding the wills for the colonial women. And if you have a copy of Dr. Porter's book, here's a little plug. If you don't have it, you probably need to go get it. But in there, she lists all of the wills that were part of her research and the areas from which those wills come from. And for those that are particular to Bexar County, and Bexar back, of course, Bexar County back then was one, there wasn't a county, and two, Bexar was everything if it wasn't La Bahia or Los Adais. But you'll find those wills at the Bear Archives. Dr. David Carlson has access to those wills, and he and Liliana are just absolutely phenomenal. And many of those are scanned, and many of them are translated, and they'll be happy to share those with you. Someone asked about Spanish colonial records. Yes, Lewis also provided a link to the Bear Archives online, which is different than Dr. Carlson's Bear Archives. Josh Bolding has a question to Erika. Did Maria Rabena have a brand, cattle brand?
Yes, she did, and she does mention that in the will, and you can also find that in the Bear Archives. Dr. Carlson can guide you on locating that.
Excellent, fantastic. Well, I tell you, this is, gosh, we could probably spend a whole day just talking about women in history, and it's unfortunate that it is such a difficult challenge and a task to find, as Karla was talking about earlier, the scholarship, right? So whether it was indigenous, the indigenous experience, or rather the women's experience, period, right? So who's documenting it? Why are they documenting it? How is it documented? And then where can you find it? And that's also something that Dr. Porter talks about in her introduction in the book as well. So hopefully you've enjoyed this evening's presentation. I will offer it up. It is already after 8 o'clock, and so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But if anybody has any last-minute questions, comments, concerns, issues for our panelists.
Well, I'd like to just say I think this was a fabulous exchange. You know, after we just don't hear about our mothers, and they're often forgotten in genealogy. We take the easy route and try to find our fathers and our grandfathers. And I just thought this was beautiful, and I was so taken by Karla's words and, you know, and the things that are important to her and everybody, Amy and Erika as well. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And yes, a huge thank you to Dr. Porter, Ms. Erika Haskins, and Ms. Karla Aguilar for making yourself available this evening. I know y'all worked hard all day long, and then you had to jump onto this call and spend an hour and a half with us, but it was an hour and a half well worth it. And I think there's enough interest here, and I think there's enough, Lord knows there's enough material to have a full-blown symposium on women in beyond Spanish colonial Texas. But I think that's something I probably am going to pursue. But nonetheless, I do want to take just a second and thank everybody for dialing in this evening. We were well represented by those that had signed up. So thank you so much for making your time available as well. We have another conversation, another matter for discussion next month on April the 6th, where we're going to talk about the first Texas independence on April the 6th. So many folks don't recognize April the 6th as Texas Independence Day, but hopefully maybe one of those days that'll change. And much of what Dr. Porter was talking about earlier and the stories that Ms. Haskins had shared as well with regards to the Spanish and the ranches, we'll find that takes a turn. And about the research that I was doing with Jesus de los Santos, she manumits her slaves as her and her husband are being labeled insurgents against the Spanish crown. So there's a period of time there that is very interesting. And so we're going to explore that next month, April the 6th, 6:30. The invite is out on Facebook, so please check us out. And until then, good evening, and thanks so much for coming. Good night.